Catherine Knight. Aberdeen, a small town in the Hunter Valley, was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Coal miners filled the pubs after long shifts, and families had lived there for generations. Catherine Knight, 44, worked at the local abattoir and was known for her skill with knives, a talent she often bragged about. Her partner, John Price, 45, was a well-liked father of 3 who had grown uneasy after years of arguments and threats. On February 29, 2000, that uneasy tension exploded into an act that would horrify the entire country. That night, after John tried to end the relationship, Knight convinced him to come home. What followed was a savage attack inside the house where his children once felt safe. Police who arrived the next day were confronted with scenes so disturbing they would haunt even seasoned officers. Neighbors later admitted they had heard cries but had not intervened, a regret many carried for years. John's children were left to face a reality no family should ever know, their lives divided forever into before and after. Australia reacted with disbelief. Aberdeen turned its back on Knight, and newspapers labelled her in the harshest terms imaginable. Experts argued on television about whether she was mentally ill or simply evil, while lawmakers pointed to the case as proof that domestic violence laws needed to be stronger. Across the country, people began looking more closely at relationships that once seemed private and untouchable. In October 2001, Knight became the first woman in Australia to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Appeals claiming insanity failed, and today, at 69, she remains in isolation, her name forever tied to one of the most shocking betrayals the nation has ever seen. Robert Paul Long. Childers, in tropical Queensland, was known as a cheerful stop for backpackers chasing work and sunshine. The Old Palace Hostel, a wooden building full of creaking floors and shared rooms, was home to travelers from all over the world. Among them was Robert Paul Long, 47, a drifting addict struggling with methamphetamine psychosis. He checked in under a false name during the 2000 harvest season, carrying anger and instability that no one around him could see. On the night of May 22nd, flames suddenly tore through the hostel. Long had soaked mattresses with accelerant and set them alight after being threatened with eviction. As fire raced through the timber halls, guests woke to smoke and screams. Some jumped from windows, others tried desperately to help friends they could not reach. By dawn, 15 young people were dead, and families were flying to Queensland to stand before a pile of ashes where their children had once planned adventures. The tragedy shook not only Australia but the world. Childers, once a lively backpacker town, fell silent as businesses closed and memorials filled the streets. Investigations exposed how vulnerable old buildings were to fire, and new safety rules were pushed through. The horror also fueled campaigns against drug abuse and arson, while communities raised money to support the grieving families and to remember those who never made it out. Long was convicted of 15 counts of murder in 2001 and sentenced to life. 2 years later, he took his own life in prison, but his actions left wounds that Queensland still carries, a reminder of how one broken man destroyed so many bright futures. Mark Valera, Chos Zax. The Adelaide Hills town of Verdun looked peaceful from the outside, quiet roads, thick bushland, homes tucked away from the world. But behind that calm setting, something terrifying had been unfolding. Mark Valera, also known as Chos Zax, drifted through South Australia in the late 1990s carrying confusion, anger, and violent fantasies. Between 1998 and 1999, he began targeting homeless men, people who already lived on the edges of society and whose disappearances went unnoticed for too long. By the time his case reached the courts in 2001, the full scale of his cruelty had begun to surface. Valera lured David Johnson and Reg Watson with promises of company and shelter. Instead, they were dragged into days of torment that ended in murder. He tried to cut the bodies apart and hide what he had done, but months later the remains were discovered, leading police into one of the darkest investigations the state had ever seen. Families waited in painful uncertainty, piecing together the final moments of men whose lives had already been fragile. South Australia was already on edge, and Valera's crimes felt like a grim echo of the Snowtown horrors. Newspapers warned about the dangers facing transient people, and questions were asked about how someone could kill so openly without being stopped. Trust in the outskirts of Adelaide weakened, and police procedures were overhauled as fear settled into everyday life. In 2001, Valera was convicted of 2 murders and sentenced to life without parole. Requests for gender transition surgery were refused, and he remains locked away, a reminder of how easily the vulnerable can become invisible targets. John Bunting. Salisbury North, on the northern edge of Adelaide, was an ordinary working suburb where families worried about bills and schools, not torture chambers. Yet inside a rented house, John Bunting built something monstrous. Charming on the surface and obsessed with punishing those he judged immoral, Bunting gathered followers, James Vlasikis and Robert Wagner among them, and over the 1990s they hunted people they labeled as preys. The truth only emerged in 1999 when barrels containing human remains were found, leading to trials that dominated the early 2000s. Victims were accused of crimes they had never committed, beaten, and tortured in secret rooms while neighbors heard little more than muffled noise. The killers stored bodies in acid-filled drums, renting sheds under fake names to hide their tracks. For years the community had lived beside these horrors without realizing it, until the smell and chance discoveries finally brought police to the door. Australia came to know the case simply as the bodies in barrels. The country recoiled in disbelief, and a wave of true crime fascination followed as people tried to understand how such cruelty could exist in suburban streets. Families of the dead pushed for stronger protections against bullying and abuse, while investigators were praised for patiently untangling a web of lies that had lasted almost a decade. Bunting was convicted of 11 murders in 2003 after investigations that stretched well beyond 2001. He was sentenced to life without parole and remains imprisoned, his appeals repeatedly rejected, his name forever tied to the darkest chapter in South Australian history. Jason Moran. In Melbourne's Ascot Vale, the early 2000s were ruled by fear. The Moran family had long been part of the city's criminal underworld, and the war with rival Carl Williams turned streets into battlefields. Jason Moran, son of notorious boss Louis Moran, survived earlier attempts on his life in 2001 as tensions exploded between competing gangs. The violence reached its peak on June 21, 2003, when Moran was shot dead in front of children at a football clinic, a killing that shocked even hardened detectives. Drive-by shootings and revenge attacks became common news. Families in the area kept their children indoors, schools went into lockdown, and ordinary residents felt trapped between criminals who treated neighborhoods like territory. The conflict spread across Melbourne, dragging in associates, relatives, and anyone unlucky enough to be connected. Victoria struggled to regain control. The story later inspired television dramas, but at the time there was nothing glamorous about it, only funerals, frightened communities, and police task forces working around the clock. Many innocent people were caught in the crossfire, and trust in public safety was badly shaken. Eventually, key figures such as Carl Williams were convicted and handed life sentences, and the gangland war slowly burned out under intense police pressure. But the scars left by those years are still remembered across Melbourne.